My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I'm returning to my Silmarillion Synopsis series with the first chapter of the third section of the Silmarillion, the Quenta Silmarillion, which is really the bulk of the story. The first two sections, the Ainulindale and the Valaquenta, telling of the music of the Ainur and the major characters among the Valar and the Maiar respectively, I've covered in two previous videos. I've got a specific playlist for the Silmarillion Synopsis where I'm keeping all these, so I'll link to that below so you can catch up if you've missed those. This one, I'm starting, as I mentioned, the Quenta Silmarillion, which is really where almost the entire bulk of the Silmarillion as a book takes place. After the Quenta Silmarillion, there's a couple other small sections that get covered, and I will get to those as well, of course, but this is where most of what the key stories of the Silmarillion happen. And the first chapter is called Of the Beginning of Days. So let's cover it. Now, in the beginning of this chapter of the Beginning of Days, which is chapter 1 of the Quenta Silmarillion, as I mentioned, we get a brief kind of allusion to the previous, that the Valar are kind of having war with Melkor in Arda. And it tells that during this time a spirit of great strength came from outside of Arda, from other parts of Ea, named Tulkas. And we've already met Tulkas in the Valaquenta, of course, but now we get kind of a history of how he came to enter Arda. He heard that there was war in the Little Kingdom, which is just another name for, the world of Arda itself, which is Earth as opposed to the universe. And he enters to help them fight off Melkor. Melkor, seeing Tulkas coming and Tulkas being the warrior type that he is, Melkor just kind of decides to leave and leave the Valar to it. But he's still rather resentful of them and wants to ruin everything they do, so he's kind of keeping an eye on things. Meanwhile, the Valar now turn their focus to really shaping Arda and getting it ready for the coming of the children of Iluvatar. So Yavanna begins to really put her efforts into the creation of trees, plants, and all the sorts of things that she is associated with. We see Varda, trying to gather light together, and Aule actually makes two great lamps, which Varda puts light into, that they set up in the far north and the far south of the world. Now, before I get too far ahead of myself, I should probably mention here, when we think of the world of Middle Earth is a term that is very literal in its significance. Middle Earth is kind of the continent that's in the middle of Arda. It doesn't really go into a lot of detail in the story here, but if you pay attention to everything that Tolkien wrote about the subject, some of the old maps that he wrote down, drew, and that sort of thing, Middle Earth is originally a continent in the middle surrounded by two oceans, and then there's two other continents out to the east and west. That's why it's called Middle Earth. So they set these up in Middle Earth in the north and south. And in the middle is a great lake with an island called Almarin, where they set up their original home. It's where the light of the lamps kind of blend together, and the greatest growth happens here. And this is kind of a period called the Spring of Arda. It's when things first start to grow and come to being. Aule is doing his thing, shaping the earth itself. The Valar are all putting forth their efforts. And when their labors kind of come to the end of their major works, Manwe kind of declares a celebration feast. And at this celebration feast, Tulkas espouses Nessa, which I've talked about in the Valaquenta episode previously. So that's when those two kind of get together, again, whatever it means for two Valar to espouse to each other. It's not really clear exactly what that means in Tolkien's conception, and it does change over time if you read the older stuff. But that's the very beginning stages of Middle Earth, and at this time, again, he doesn't go into a lot of detail in the Silmarillion as we have it published. There's a little more detail in some of the older versions that you can find, but the idea is at this point the world is fairly symmetrical, and it's also flat. It's not a globe yet. I've actually got a video on the shaping of Arda, which goes into a little bit of this. I've also linked to that, I believe, in the Ainulindale, but I'll link to it here again as well, so you can get a reference for that sort of thing. But the basic idea is it's a very symmetrical world at this point. They're all kind of happy Melkor is gone, but that's all about to change. Now, as has been mentioned previously in earlier parts of the Silmarillion, Melkor had corrupted others of the Ainur to his service, and in particular, some of the Maiar who are with the Valar in Arda are still on his side, and they kind of pass him knowledge secretly of what's going on, and he comes and kind of takes a look at what's happened in Middle-earth and the rest of Arda while he's been gone, and he hates the Valar even more. He's really not happy with what's going on because he wants to rule it, and he's unhappy that the rest of them are happy without him being there. So he plans to re-enter Arda and try to take it for himself. Now he does this while they're kind of having their celebration. He sees that Tulkas, being weary and content, is kind of just resting, taking a nap. Seems kind of weird to say that, but that's essentially what it says in the Silmarillion. But so he sees his chance. He enters Arda again with the Maiar that he gathers to himself, and he begins the building of his great fortress of Utumno in the far north of Middle-earth, beyond even the northern lamp. And so for a while, the Valar aren't really aware of his presence there. He's kind of way, way off, and the light doesn't really, he's not casting any shadows, the other way, because he's on the other side of the lamp. So the Valar don't really know that he's there. But his presence and the presence of the other evil Maiar with him and the building of Utumno begin to really create a lot of corruption in the northern parts of Middle-earth. Green things die, living things become corrupted and all this sort of thing. So the Valar finally notice that this is happening, and they realize Melkor is back in Arda. So they start to prepare to look for him, but Melkor, trying to beat them to the punch, and with Utumno completely built and he thinks impregnable, decides to strike first. And so he does. He attacks. He actually throws down the two lamps. And as a result of the lamps being overthrown, the light is lost, of course. There's fires all over Arda because of the fire that was in the lamps. And the lamps themselves, the physical parts of them, have damaged Middle-earth, so that a lot of the symmetry that I mentioned earlier is now not, Arda is no longer symmetrical. A lot of damage gets done, a lot of things are burned up. The light being gone now, the living things that have begun to grow, that stops. So the trees are no longer growing, and they just kind of go into a dormant state. And in all of this process, Melkor is, trying to just make as much havoc as possible. But when he hears Manwë's voice and he hears the rumble of Tulkas's feet coming after him, he decides, well, I think I'll just hide out in Utumno again. He goes and retreats, and the Valar, being so busy trying to just prevent more damage to Arda as a result of the damage that he had already done, weren't able to overcome him and, just destroy Utumno at this point. And so most of their energy was spent doing things just to save what they could. Once that was all done, they didn't then go off and fight Melkor again. Their home in the Isle of Almarin was destroyed as well, so they didn't really have a dwelling place in Middle-earth. And so we get the first of a few actions that seem kind of passive on the part of the Valar, but you'll see what I mean as we get further into the story. They settle in the west of Middle-earth, beyond the Great Sea, which is also known as Belegair, that's the Elvish for it, in the continent of Aman, and that's where the next part of this story goes. Once in the continent of Aman, the Valar begin to set up a defensive posture, basically. They raise a huge range of mountains on the eastern side of the continent towards the Great Sea, which are known as the Pelori. You won't really need to know that. In fact, most of the names that I'm probably going to drop here, you don't really need to know, especially because once we get the action back in Middle-earth, none of it will be relevant for the most part. But in case you're interested, I will be dropping a few actual names. Anyway, they raise the Pelori as basically a defense against Melkor to keep him out. And they begin kind of setting up their realm on the continent of Aman itself. And the land behind the mountains becomes known as Valinor, and literally that just means the land of the Valar. That's all that means. But it's the part behind the mountains, because there is still some land beyond the mountains before you get to the sea. It's only the land behind the mountains that is actually Valinor, because that's where the Valar actually live, and more significantly, the rest of this story in this chapter kind of focuses on things that make it more special, and that particularly involves the creation of the Two Trees of Valinor. I've actually done a video on the total history of the trees, so you can check that out if you don't mind spoilers. I will link to that in the description below too. But at first, they're just kind of building a realm there. They build the city of Valmar, which is kind of their main abiding place. You have Taniquetil, the highest peak on anywhere in Arda, is where Manwë dwells with Varda. And once they've kind of set up their realm, Yavanna then goes to the Green Mound just outside of Valmar, and the Green Mound is called Azelohar. I don't think we actually get a translation of that, which is also near the Ring of Doom, which that will come up a couple more times before we leave Valinor for good. But she goes there and she begins to sing, and most of the Valar just kind of stop and watch as she's doing this. Nienna, however, is not just watching. She is also on the mound, and she is watering the grass basically with her tears. Something that she tends to do a lot is cry, being the Valar most associated with pity and sorrow. As the Valar watch, Yavanna's song brings forth two trees. The first, literally in time, is Telperion. It has dark green leaves which are silver underneath, and they drop kind of a silvery dew as they, well, I mean, just period, and they have silver flowers. And then second comes the tree Laurelin, which is bright green leaves, golden edged, and has golden flowers which give off warmth as well as golden dew, which you get the idea I mean, these are literally sources of light, but it's light kind of captured in a physical form. So these are the two trees of Valinor, and this, it says, is the most significant thing Yavanna ever does. And about these two trees, the fate of Arda is basically built. Everything that happens later is pretty much revolving around these two trees in some way or another, and you'll understand why as we get further along. Or if you just want to skip ahead and check out my video on the trees, you can figure out why there. But if you want to follow the story chronologically and you don't already know the answer to that, save that for later. So anyway, the two trees come up and they begin catching the dew, or the light that comes off of these in great vats, and hoarding the light. Varda, of course, had already also gathered a bunch of light in Valinor. They saved as much of the light as they could, again indicating that light is almost a physical substance. And you get that too later, where Varda creates the stars. Well, actually earlier and later. I think it comes up in two places. But you've got that going on. And not only that, but the two trees, specifically with the birth of the two trees, you get the beginning of the count of time. And so that's why this chapter is called the beginning of days. Now, the way that it works is a little bit different than our days. Telperion and Laurelin both kind of wane to nothing and then begin to wax up again to full light, basically, in a 7-hour time frame. So, but the way that they do that, they overlap each other a bit. The first hour that one tree begins to wax is also the last hour of the waning of the other tree. So as Telperion finishes his first period of light, Laurelin first begins to grow, and thus there's an hour on each end that you've got a mingling of the lights. And this is kind of the most beautiful period of the day of Arda. And this happens twice in a day because they measure a day by 12 hours. So it's not a 24-hour day as we measure it. We don't have a sun and moon in Middle Earth yet. So for now, the days are 12 hours measured by the waning and waxing of the two trees. And thus the beginning of the count of time has come, and now things will begin to kind of proceed apace. Things get a little bit more interesting. That's kind of the end of the beginning of days, but then the last part of this chapter actually kind of gives us a little bit of a preview of what's coming, so let's talk about that too. Now, interestingly, this last part of the chapter starts off with a reference to the coming of the children of Iluvatar being near, which is weird because it doesn't actually get to that in this chapter. It then kind of goes into a description of what the Valar are doing, and a lot of it we've already kind of encountered in the Vala Quenta. Manwë is gathering news from the eagles and from his power of sight that he has. Ulmo is gathering news through the waters and that sort of thing. Yavanna is still taking thought for Middle-earth and the things that no longer grow there because there's no light. Ulmo is still got Middle-earth very much in his mind as well, not just Yavanna. And Orome, as we've already learned, also sometimes still rides in Middle-earth, basically scaring away Melkor's monsters and servants. So some of the Valar are still thinking about Middle-earth, but most of them are just kind of content to be very passive in Valinor. But nevertheless, the coming of the children is near, it tells us. So we've got a little bit of looking back at what we already found out, and a little bit of looking forward, and then it kind of goes into a description of what the children will be like. It reminds us that the third theme of Iluvatar, which deals with the children, was solely Iluvatar's work. The Valar, all the Ainur really, didn't really understand what the third theme was about, and so none of them really wanted to touch it or tinker with it, because as I mentioned in the Ainulindale video, they had been given permission to kind of improvise their own parts of the music, but none of them did that with the third theme. And so it tells us that as a result, the children of Iluvatar being independent of the Valar, or any of the Ainur, again, the Valar are to them more like chieftains or elders rather than masters. And it even tells us that to the extent that they try to force the children to do anything that they don't want to do, it usually goes wrong. And so you've already got this idea that they're not really supposed to be controlling them in any sense, and thus we see a reference to the idea that calling the Valar gods is almost kind of a misconception. It doesn't say that in the Silmarillion, but it's kind of hinted at. And then it kind of goes into a little bit of a differentiation of the two children. The firstborn, or the elves, which are called the Quendi here, although it doesn't tell us why, that'll come later. It tells us that they will have the greater beauty, and they will create the greater beauty and have the greater bliss in Arda itself. And they'll basically, make some of the greatest things in Arda, and they'll have, they'll be the most beautiful of the things in Arda, of the creatures in Arda, I should say. And it tells us that the men, the second-born, or the Atani, they will not be as great as the elves in that sense, but they will have what it calls strange gifts, and that has the idea of they will be seeking for something beyond the circles of the world. They won't be really content with being in Arda, whereas the elves are kind of bound up with Arda, and their lives are coextensive with it, and elves will survive until the end. Even though they can be killed, they will go to the halls of Mondos, and then they can return after that. Men, on the other hand, they die and they leave the circles of the world. We're not told what that means because it tells us the elves don't know what that means. But it also tells us that along with that, men have the ability to kind of escape the music of the Ainur, which is as fate to everything else in Arda. So we get the idea that the elves, in some sense, are not as free as men are in a free will sense. It's not really made clear exactly how that works out, but it is made clear that the music of the Ainur, in some sense, is determinative as to basically everything but men. So that's a pretty significant aspect, and it also tells us that Iluvatar kind of knew in advance that because of the evils of the world and that sort of thing, men would often go astray. And then it tells us that the elves, kind of as a result, see men as being a grief to Manwë, even though Manwë is kind of the most attuned to Iluvatar's purposes, and also that they kind of think of men as being most like Melkor as compared with any of the other Valar. They're also much less likely to be like the Valar or follow them. And it also tells us that the elves are most like the Valar in terms of their nature, which probably has something to do with their immortality and that sort of thing. Whereas the men are not really quite the same. So it's kind of setting up what we're going to see later when the children of Iluvatar really come on the scene, but it's not really giving us a whole lot of detail yet. It's just kind of looking forward a little bit to give us a little bit of an idea of what we might expect when we first see them. So that is the end of Quenta Chapter 1, Quenta Silmarillion Chapter 1 of the Beginning of Days. So that is the first chapter of the Quenta Silmarillion, which is where we really start getting into the history of what we would think of as Middle-earth, or Arda technically. And we're starting to get a little bit more interesting material beyond just the, angelic beings that we've encountered so far. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. If you want to follow this series or follow the channel generally, then you can subscribe, of course. Please do that here. You can find a couple of my previous videos up here, and of course, as I mentioned, I will link to the Silmarillion Synopsis playlist as well, so you can keep up with it there, just those videos. And other than that, if you would like to support the channel, you can do so by visiting my Patreon page, which will be in the description as well. Until next time, I am the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.